Tell me what you're doing and what the Senate is doing there to move some of these reforms through that DOGE Act process.
Given the fact that President Trump is in office and he's willing to let people like Elon Musk and DOGE, I think this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity.
You've had a tumultuous relationship, maybe a nice way to say it, with the Second Amendment rights community. Ready to roll?
Yep.
All right.
Real Texan.
Why should this matter to real Texans? Thanks for joining this conversation with Real Texans, where we talk with folks who are making an impact on the Lone Star State. Excited to be sitting down with our senior U.S. Senator, John Cornyn. You hold the seat that Sam Houston first occupied. John Tower, the first Republican, took that seat. Phil Gramm, your predecessor, held that seat. You, though, didn't start off running for the U.S. Senate. You started off running as a state district judge back in the mid-1980s. That's kind of an unlikely path to the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, it sure is.
District judge.
It sure is. Well, I was practicing law in San Antonio when my wife's best friend's husband was appointed by Governor Clements to a district bench. And so we got involved in his election campaign, which followed very closely. And then when he got elected, and actually the first 4 Republicans in Bexar County got elected to the district court, then the next election, people were looking for somebody else to run. And they said, how about you? Because I had white hair, and I was
tall guy with white hair.
I was and I was wearing a suit, and so I looked, presentable. So I was 31 years old, and that was the beginning of my run for elected office, and it's been quite a ride.
Yeah. Okay. So you were the district judge, and a lot of times today when we look at our Supreme Court in Texas, while it's an elected position,
right,
a lot of them end up getting there through appointment because kind of the structure and other things, politics, mostly irrelevant. You ran for the Supreme Court in 1990. We were still a mostly Democrat state, maybe a different kind of Democrat state. Ann Richards was the governor. You sure weren't going to get an appointment from her. So what kind of inspired you to go from running for district judge to running for Supreme Court?
Well, Republicans have always been the reformers in a state that, as you point out, has been predominantly Democrat. That was true at the district court level. We had a group called the Committee for Judicial Reform that running against the good old boys at the Bexar County Courthouse. Right. Kind of the same thing at the Texas Supreme Court. The first Republicans were appointed in 1988, I think, by Governor Clements. And then, but the trial lawyers pretty much dominated the Supreme Court. But we had a coalition of the business community, the physicians and others to recruit candidates. And they asked me if I would be interested in running. And I thought, sure. And as improbable as it would seem, I actually got elected. But we had 2 Republicans elected that term and a Democrat. And to your point, that was right at the point where Texas was turning from an all-Democratic state to then becoming the dominant Republican powerhouse that it is today.
Right. Okay. So serving on the judiciary gives you a little bit, or serving in the judiciary gives you a little different perspective as U.S. Senator, because you sit on the Judiciary Committee, which means you guys interview all the federal appointees to the bench. This has been a complaint for a while. I think a lot of us are seeing it even more so today. The activist judges. I think Ted Cruz referred to them as the black-robed philosopher kings, which has always been kind of a fun turn of phrase in my head. What can be done with a problem like the judiciary, where we see district federal judges saying, no, you can't, you have to keep this verbiage on a website 2 weeks ago. You've got a federal judge mad that illegal aliens who are cartel members are being flown back to their home countries to serve their prison sentences. What do we do about this stuff?
Well, it's some crazy stuff, to be sure. Well, part of the problem is cherry picking these judges, venue shopping, and in the verbiage used by judges and lawyers, venue shopping, cherry picking jurisdiction, where you think you might have a favorable judge, somebody sympathetic to your point of view, and then they proceed to issue a nationwide orders, temporary restraining orders, which means that the other side doesn't get to appear. This just happens, and then it controls the country. So this is one of the things that I hope the Supreme Court is going to be addressing. They've been talking about it for years, the inappropriateness of judges with a discrete jurisdiction in one district in the United States, then trying to enter orders that affect the entire nation and basically restrict the powers of the executive. And President Trump has been very aggressive. I'm really happy to see him testing the limits of some of these precedents that I think need to be tested. But I think the best solution to a bad decision by a district judge is to appeal it, and that's happening. And Ted and I have worked very hard with President Trump in his first term. One of the biggest accomplishments of that first term of President Trump is he nominated and we confirmed about 235 different federal judges, including 3 on the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're hard at work doing that again. So that's the other part of the answer is let's get some good rule of law judges in these positions and get rid of some of these folks who are basically politicians wearing black robes.
If my memory is correct, and it may or may not be, someone will fact check us here in a minute. Fact check me here in a minute. I think there've been about 15 federal judges who have been impeached in the
history
course of the United States,
right.
140 some odd years of the United States under the Constitution. Others have been impeached by the House, but they've resigned. They've quit. But only 15 have been convicted by the Senate. We do though have guys like Brendan Gill from here in Texas and others who are saying, hey, maybe we need to be a little more forceful in impeachment.
Right.
Should we? Should federal judges maybe feel the sting of impeachment? They have no other check, it feels like.
Well, I don't think it hurts.
You have the check of, 30 million Texans.
Right. I get my report card graded on a regular basis. They don't because they have lifetime tenure. I think that may have a beneficial impact, just even the possibility that, you might find yourself held accountable in the House of Representatives through an impeachment proceeding. But it is hard, and certainly to get the votes in a very thin margin for Republicans in the House. And then, as you point out, a trial in front of the U.S. Senate. So it's pretty rare. But so I think as a practical matter, it doesn't happen often, and when it does, only in the most egregious cases. But I don't think it hurts to have federal judges sort of know in the back of their brain, that, somebody's watching,
right.
Which H.L. Mencken, I think, called the definition of conscience, knowing that somebody somewhere is watching.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Great Mencken quote, by the way. Yeah. If you quote H.L. Mencken, you get high points in there. All right. You mentioned Donald Trump's first term, and now, of course, we have this very unique second term that was interfered with by 4 years of Joe Biden. But in this opportunity, we see this very quirky process that that many of us, if we even knew it existed, it sounded like something called reconciliation,
right?
Because Congress has not seen fit to do budgets in a long time. Instead, we do concurring resolutions, right, and reconciliation, rather than just figuring out how much money needs to be spent. But this reconciliation process seems like it's one where the president's DOGE push really has a lot of opportunity. The one big beautiful bill, I think the president has called it.
He does.
Tell me what you're doing and what the Senate is doing there to move some of these reforms through that DOGE Act process.
Well, I'm chuckling as you're talking about reconciliation and all the technical stuff we do. That sounds almost biblical, right?
It does,
reconciliation.
It does, yeah.
It's not like that. So that's basically the name for us. Number one, setting a budget, which is the limits on how much the federal government spends. As we all know, the federal government's deeply in debt, and it spends roughly $6.7 trillion a year through various programs, discretionary spending, mandatory spending, and then the tax code. And so this is the way that we passed the tax reform bill in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And as you know, many of those provisions are expiring in 2025, which would result in a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase on 62% of American taxpayers, and on top of 40-year high inflation. It's a bad idea. So this is the means by which we extend those expiring tax cuts. But I think given the fact that President Trump is in office and he's willing to let people like Elon Musk and DOGE identify some of the most outrageous examples of wasteful tax expenditures, that we have a great opportunity to begin to start cutting some of these spending programs and to begin to bend that debt curve, as we must, because now we are spending more money on interest on the national debt than we are on defense spending in a very dangerous world. So I think this is a once in a generation opportunity. Thanks to President Trump. Sometimes I'll refer to him as an unconventional president because he is willing to do things that I don't think other more conventional presidents were willing to do. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and I'm excited about it.
When we hear folks talk about, you'll sit there and listen to the left-wing media, the Democrats, which I guess is kind of the same thing. They talk about this process in terms of cuts, but you actually can use the word cut, but yet in many ways we're talking about reducing the rates of increase in many cases. We're not actually talking about cutting in the way the Sullivan family or the Cornyn family might have to say and say, well, we can't go out this month. We're cutting out that spending. Instead, it's, well, we're only going to go out, 30 nights a week instead of 31 nights.
Well, the federal spending's on that kind of trajectory and debt, and now we want to modify it so it's not growing as fast, and that's actually produces some savings. But you're exactly right. The media does not do us any favors when it comes to accurately reporting what's happening. And of course, they're partisans who mischaracterize it for their own purposes, and frankly, some gullible media who are willing to report anything and everything they say, which is why we need robust media alternatives for people so they can find out what the facts are. But we can't continue on this same trajectory. I know you and I probably can't get our brain around this idea of $36 trillion in debt. It's just so much money. But what it means,
generations to count that high.
Absolutely. Yeah. And basically it means you and I are writing checks that our kids and grandkids and maybe our great grandkids will have to cash. And and it's, as I point out, this is about 10 years ago, Admiral Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that the biggest threat to our national security was the debt. And now I understand what he means. And so, as I said, this is a great opportunity, and shame on us if we miss the opportunity and squander it.
So while the media and the Democrats will refer to as reduction of increase in spending as cuts, on the other hand, keeping tax rates as they are referred to as tax cuts.
It's crazy. It's crazy. It's scoring these bills is sort of what you're alluding to. And, there's this debate about, well, should it be current policy or current law? Current policy is, as you point out, the current tax rates. Current law is they expire at the end of 2025. So, but it's kind of misleading because we're still spending the same amount of money. We're still accruing debt at the same rate. But but we have to do something now, and I think we will on this trajectory because it can't continue. And Republicans, including this Republican, have talked a long time about dealing with our national debt, and I hear a lot about that from constituents around the state. But we haven't really had the means to accomplish that in place, which is, as I said, a president willing to tackle this and majorities in the House and the Senate. So this is our time.
Milton Friedman said that if a tax cut produces more revenues, you haven't cut taxes enough. What is the likelihood? Right now, I know that the push with the DOGE Act is to just keep the tax cuts passed back in 2017 in place. What is the likelihood of a Republican House and a Republican Senate with a Republican president actually giving us real tax cuts and tax cuts that don't expire, the day after tomorrow?
Yeah, a lot of that was the permanency or non-permanency in this case of the tax cuts we passed in 2017 was a function of the Budget Control Act, and I won't bother you with the details of that. But President Trump has said we maybe should get more aggressive when it comes to the tax rates. What we've seen is that many businesses have located in places like Ireland and other places where they have understand that this is a competition for the sort of investment and job creation that comes along with lower tax rates. So I've never seen a tax that I wasn't willing to cut. And so I'm certainly open to that. It's a collaborative process. Obviously, I'm not going to make the decision all by myself. It's going to be 51 Republicans in the Senate and 218 Republicans in the House. And getting to that sort of convergence is not easy. It's hard. And kudos to Speaker Johnson, Jody Arrington, our budget chairman, our Texas colleague up in the Panhandle, for getting the House budget resolution done. The Senate's been the laggard so far, and we need to catch up soon, because if we don't get this done by the summertime, then I think we will have missed our window of opportunity.
I think it's 1974, the
Budget Act.
Yeah, the Budget Act, the Impoundment Act.
Right.
Reduced the ability of a president to say, yeah, Congress allocated this cash. This is wasteful spending.
Right.
And so you can't. So the Budget Impoundment Act kind of tried to stop presidents from doing that. And you've now got a president, unlike many before him, a president who's willing to say, no, we're not spending this money.
Right.
The secretary, I don't care what the Congress designated, we're shutting down the Department of Education. We're shutting down these programs. It feels like the Thou Shalt Waste Money caucus is fairly bipartisan in Washington.
Yeah. It's,
how do we address this?
Well, spending money is popular.
Yeah.
But it's also
other people's money.
That's popular, no question about that. Well, there's two things we can do. One is do rescissions, and that is a process by which the president proposes a package of spending cuts to Congress, and then Congress can pass on a privileged basis with a majority in both houses. And so the DOGE process that Department of Government Efficiency has undertaken, and which has been great, exposing all this extravagant and reckless spending, we can then take that budget, that package, and pass rescissions to cut those. But secondly, I think President Trump, as I mentioned earlier, has been pretty aggressive at testing the limits of executive power, including, I think, the impact of the Anti-Impoundment Act. And I expect that to make its way back to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's been a long time. I think that was back in Richard Nixon's day, if I'm not mistaken.
In the Nixon-Ford era.
And there's been a lot changed since then. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says. But the alternative, as you point out, is just kind of like continue spending, even though we know we have a problem, as long as Congress continues to appropriate the money.
So Texas, over the past few years, has been forced to spend about $11 billion in state money to protect the border because the federal government wasn't doing its job.
Right.
Yet you and your colleagues in Congress, sending $175 billion to Ukraine for their border problem. Meanwhile, we've got little girls like Houston's Jocelyn Nungry being raped and murdered by illegal aliens. I mean, it feels like the priorities, with all due respect, of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, the federal government have been completely out of whack, as evidenced by our spending.
Well, Congress and the federal government have to do a lot of different things at the same time. But I couldn't agree with you more that the federal government under the Biden administration has completely abdicated its responsibility to secure the border. Hence, we're working with Governor Abbott and the Texas delegation to recoup the $11.1 billion that Texas has had to spend that should have been incurred by the federal taxpayer, and but the Biden administration refused to do. The President Trump talks about strength, peace through strength. Ronald Reagan famously talked about that. And I know there are people of goodwill and good faith who have different views about what America's role in the world should be. I support President Trump's position that we should have a peace process in Ukraine. It's been going on much longer than anybody would have dreamed, especially Vladimir Putin. He thought he was going to take Ukraine in a matter of weeks, especially after he saw President Biden abdicate any responsibility in Afghanistan. I think Putin thought he could walk into Ukraine and take it without a shot being fired. But the Ukrainians had other ideas, and President Zelenskyy, I think, has been pretty heroic in his leading the resistance. But hundreds of thousands of people have died on both sides, and that certainly needs to come to an end if it can. Unfortunately, I don't think Putin is very trustworthy, and so there need to be sufficient security guarantees to make sure this just he doesn't like rearm, reset, and do it again. But I think it's also sends a signal around the world. President Xi in China, which is our number one existential threat, whether it be a military conflict breakout in the Indo-Pacific, he's watching too to see, is the United States a reliable ally can he pressure us in a way that will allow him to, let's say, take Taiwan, which he said he wants to do by 2027. He's told the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan. So it's, again, I think there are people of goodwill who have sort of different ideas about what the priorities should be, but I think we need to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And that means secure our border, which we've tried to do. We've certainly, it's been a consistent theme of mine and Senator Cruz and the Texas delegation, because we are on the front lines of this, but also to deal with some of the threats, the geopolitical threats that threaten the potential of another world war.
So I want to dig down in Ukraine for a second. I don't think there's anyone on the planet, except for maybe Putin's immediate advisors, who would say there's anything other than a really bad guy.
Yeah,
Putin's a bad guy.
He's a very bad guy.
He's not. He is not a good guy. He's a bad guy.
He's bad. He's evil.
But yet Zelenskyy, a guy who cancels elections in his own country, campaigned for Kamala Harris in our country.
Yeah.
And then acted like a petulant, spoiled brat in the Oval Office.
Yeah, he's made a lot of mistakes. And
why do you think of him as a hero?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of resisting the Russian invasion is what I was referring to. I wasn't suggesting he was a perfect individual or without fault. Certainly he is. But I think, unfortunately, it's sort of a zero-sum game. Are we going to support Putin or support Zelenskyy? And rather than, let's not make it personality-driven, let's say Russian aggression versus the Ukrainians defending themselves. But here's something that I think is not really fully appreciated, sort of historical fact. 1994, Ukraine had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, something called the Budapest Memorandum you're familiar with, where the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia agreed to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity if they would relinquish their nuclear weapons, which they did. Well, it turns out that was probably a mistake for Ukraine relative to the potential for Russian aggression. So clearly, Putin had violated any promise Russia made in order to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. The real concern I have is even what happens after Ukraine. And of course, NATO, which President Trump has quite appropriately said, you Europeans need to, pay up and provide more for your collective self-defense. But we are part of that alliance. And if in fact the war in Ukraine were to spill over into NATO, then we would be obligated by Article 5 of that treaty to participate in the collective defense of Europe. So all of this is to say that this is very dangerous stuff.
Right.
And I don't know anybody who claims to be 100% right or understand with certainty exactly what the consequences would be. But I certainly support what President Trump's trying to do and trying to bring peace there, and I'm hopeful that he's successful.
Have Americans gotten a good deal out of the, call it $175 billion that we've spent on Ukraine? Of course, $100 billion of that has been spent in the United States for weapon systems and other kind of support things. Over 75-ish billion in direct aid to Ukraine. Have the American people gotten a good deal? What is the measure that an American taxpayer should use to judge, is this good cash? I get Billy and Fred, beating each other up in the playground, kind of looks bad, but what's the measure that we should use as taxpayers to know that's a good use of our money?
Well, I would say avoiding a larger war would be maybe the best answer. Maybe I can think of even a better answer, but Europe has been through two world wars, and with catastrophic results, with tens of millions of people dead. My dad was a B-17 pilot in World War II and was shot down in his 26th mission and was a POW the last few months of World War II. And I know he thought, and all that generation thought, that would be the last war that we would have to fight. And we've lived through what Bob Gates has called a holiday from history, where this unprecedented area of peace during the Cold War. It wasn't a hot war; it was a Cold War. Right. We've sort of thought this is the new normal, but sadly, that is not the reality of it. And so, I think part of this is how much it costs us in treasure, but part of the consideration is how much it costs us in terms of blood and young Americans dying in foreign battlefields. So something we want to avoid. You and I both want to avoid it at almost all costs. So I think supporting Ukraine's effort to defend itself and then limiting the possibility that this could extend into NATO countries and thus require the United States, by virtue of treaty, to go to the defense in a war in Europe again, the third time in the last 100+ years, would be catastrophic. So from that standpoint, I think it's been the better part of the bargain.
I want to shift gears. You've had a tumultuous relationship, maybe a nice way to say it, with the kind of the Second Amendment rights community. You were involved in pushing, involved with an effort for red flag laws that got folks upset. How can you reassure those folks about what John Cornyn is doing to protect the Second Amendment? But do you not think that's an area worthy of their concern?
No, I mean, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and my record, I think, demonstrates that. People ask me occasionally, how many guns do you own? And I usually say, well, not as many as I want. But firearms in the hands of law-abiding citizens are not a threat to public safety. That's what I continue to try to press our Democratic friends or the gun grabbers from, tell them, that's not going to make our community safer to confiscate the weapon from a law-abiding citizen. So I think what you're alluding to is what happened after the massacre of about 19 children in Uvalde, terrible event. And I think 2 teachers died at the same time. And we were looking at what the circumstances that led to that were. And as it turned out, Salvador Ramos, a young man who was a ticking time bomb known to everybody in the community as being unstable, probably mentally ill, was able to purchase firearms because on his 18th birthday, the National Instant Criminal Background Check did not look back at his juvenile record. If it had, it would have discovered his mental health and criminal record, which would have disqualified him under existing law. And actually, the Texas legislature subsequently extended the background check to pre-18, back to age 16, I believe it is, in almost a unanimous basis. So that actually has worked very well to make sure that, one area that I think there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is consensus generally, even among strong advocates of the Second Amendment, that you want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and people who are mentally ill. Now, I want to correct one thing you said about red flag. Texas doesn't have a red flag law, and I did nothing to support red flags. What we did is say for states like Texas that didn't have red flag laws, we would support things like veterans courts, mental health courts, and other intervention to help people who needed help and to keep them from hurting themselves and other people. But we also, in that particular legislation, made the single largest investment in community-based mental health care in American history, which I think is really important. I mean, this has been a big problem, especially so post-COVID with all the isolation, particularly among children and the like. So I think on balance, the goal of that legislation was to save lives and not limit the rights of law-abiding citizens. Now, I realize, because I do read social media from time to time, that some people have mischaracterized what we did, and I understand, so I understand some of the concern, but I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish there, because I do think it saved lives, and I haven't heard from a single law-abiding citizen that they've been deprived their Second Amendment rights, and I would be shocked if there was such a person.
Would you acknowledge there's definitely this concern? We talked earlier about a judiciary that's run amok. We have to guard against the threat, or guard against the possibility of, of a activist judge saying, "Oh, that Cornyn guy looks a little crazy in the eyes, so maybe we need to take away his guns."
Well, that's where due process is sacrosanct. Mm-hmm. It is a constitutional right, after all. It's part of the Bill of Rights, as you know, and so you can't violate somebody's constitutional rights without due process, without notice and opportunity to be heard, is what we always, sort of the formula we'd always use. So that's why some of these red flag laws, I think, are unconstitutional. Some of them go to great lengths to make sure that there is due process. I know Florida, under Republican governors and legislature, passed a red flag law that does provide due process, but we made very clear in the bill that passed that those states that did not have adequate due process protections in their red flag laws would not be able to qualify for the funds that were made available.
Okay, so before we run out of time here, I have to ask you about what might be the most contentious thing you do, the thing that seems to get folks.
You're talking about me?
Yeah, I'm talking about you.
Okay.
It seems to get folks ready to tar and feather you and run you out of town. Are these photographs that you seem to take a certain glee in shoving up on there of your family's brisket recipe? What in the world is this that you're doing to us?
Well, the last thing I would imagine that a brisket recipe would trigger this kind of response.
You've unified Texas in many ways.
Well, I love brisket as much as the next Texan, and I of all kinds on all recipes. I haven't found a brisket recipe that I don't like. But the funny thing when I posted that, it was the recipe that my wife uses that she got from her mother, and they were natives of Wisconsin, so not Texas. And so they had this recipe that had a little bit more like tomato sauce and all that on it. But no, I've not found a single brisket recipe that I disliked. But some people apparently did not like that one, and they let their voice be heard.
There you go.
Which is their right.
Well, Senator John Cornyn, thank you for sitting down today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Real Texans.